We're always told that free markets are the best, most efficient way to run an economy. But if that's really true, why are governments always stepping in? Today we're going to dive into the massive and often controversial world of government intervention, a really core topic for anyone studying economics.
It's the big puzzle, isn't it? You've got this idea of the invisible hand, that markets will just sort everything out on their own. But in the real world, governments are involved in pretty much every part of our economic lives. The reason why all boils down to two simple words: market failure.
Simply put, sometimes the market just gets it wrong. It might produce way too much pollution and not nearly enough public parks. Or maybe it fails to provide essential things like lighthouses at all. This is what economists call market failure, and it's the #1 reason governments get involved, to try and steer things in a better direction.
So what are these failures exactly? To understand why governments intervene, we first have to look at the specific problems they're trying to fix. You can think of it like a doctor trying to diagnose an illness before they can prescribe any medicine.
Yeah, just think about it for a second. If a private company decided to build a lighthouse, how on earth could it charge every single ship that uses its light to stay safe? It can't. And if you know you can get the benefit for free, why would you voluntarily pay for it? That's the classic free rider problem.
And that lighthouse is a perfect example of what economists call a public good. Because private companies can't really make a profit from them, they just don't have an incentive to provide them, even if they're things that society really needs. And that's exactly why things like national defense, streetlights, and flood defenses are pretty much always paid for by the government through taxes.
Okay, another major market failure happens when we just don't have all the information to make the best decisions for ourselves. For example, we might not fully appreciate the long-term benefits of getting an education, so we underinvest in it. On the other hand, we might not really understand the long-term health risks of sugary drinks, and so we consume way too many. In both cases, this imperfect information leads the market to a bad outcome.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the problems. We don't get enough public goods, and we consume too much or too little of other things. So now, let's pop open the government's toolkit and look at the actual policies they use to try and fix all this. This is a really common challenge for policymakers. If people are consuming too much of something that's bad for them and for society, how do you get them to change their behavior without just banning it completely? Well, one of the most common tools is to just make it more expensive.
And that's exactly where indirect taxes come in. You see them everywhere, on fuel, alcohol, cigarettes. By adding a tax, the government makes it more expensive for companies to produce, so they raise the price for us. The goal is pretty straightforward. A higher price should, thanks to the law of demand, mean people buy less of it, hopefully moving consumption closer to a healthier level for everyone.
Now let's flip that around. What if we want people to consume more of something beneficial? How do you encourage people to do things that have positive benefits for society, like installing solar panels or going to college?
Well, they do that with a subsidy, which is basically the opposite of a tax. The government gives money to producers, and that lowers their costs. Let's walk through what's happening here. The subsidy shifts the entire supply curve to the right. What that does is create a new market equilibrium with a lower price for consumers and a higher quantity being sold. It's a perfect tool for encouraging things like renewable energy or vaccinations.
All right, let's look at an even more direct tool, just controlling the price. A really common and, let's be honest, often controversial example of this is rent control, where the government sets a legal cap on what landlords can charge. So what happens when you do that?
This diagram shows it perfectly. The free market wants to be at its natural equilibrium price, but the government steps in and imposes a price ceiling below that point. At this new artificially low price, the number of people who want to rent an apartment shoots way up, but the number of landlords willing to supply apartments drops. This huge gap right here between demand and supply, well, that's a shortage. The policy wanted to make housing affordable, but it can end up creating long waiting lists. What about helping producers instead of consumers? The prices of things like corn and wheat can be super volatile, so governments often want to guarantee farmers a stable and fair income. So how do they pull that off?
They use something called a price floor, a guaranteed minimum price that's set above what the market would normally pay. Now, this definitely helps the farmers' incomes, but it creates a whole new problem. At that artificially high price, farmers are encouraged to produce a lot, but consumers buy less. The result is a huge excess supply, or a surplus, which the government often has to buy and store, all at the taxpayer's expense.
So far, we've been focused on efficiency, on making the economic pie as big as we can by fixing these market failures. But governments also care deeply about how that pie is sliced up. This brings us to the second huge reason for intervention: creating a fairer, more equitable society.
Let's be real. A pure, unregulated market doesn't guarantee fair outcomes. It tends to reward skills that are rare and in high demand, and that can lead to these vast differences in how much people earn. This creates a fundamental question for any society. Is the way the market distributes income and wealth okay, or should we do something about it?
And when we talk about this, it's so important to distinguish between two key concepts. Income is a flow of money, like your weekly paycheck. Wealth is a stock of assets you own at a single point in time. Your house, your savings, your investments. They are definitely related, but they are not the same thing, and governments have different policies to address inequality in both.
So, how do governments actually try to re-slice that economic pie? Well, their main tools include progressive taxes, where higher earners pay a larger percentage of their income. They use transfer payments like unemployment benefits to support people in need. They set a minimum wage to try and boost low incomes. And they provide essential services like state-funded education and healthcare, which creates a really crucial safety net for everyone.
Okay, all of these interventions sound pretty good in theory, right? The government sees a problem, pulls a tool out of its kit, and makes things better. But what happens when the cure ends up being worse than the disease? Sometimes the government's attempt to fix a problem can seriously backfire.
This is the critical counter-argument that you always have to consider. Just because a market has failed doesn't automatically mean that a government intervention is going to make things better. What if the policy is poorly designed, or it has all these unintended consequences, or it's just plain inefficient?
And this brings us to the crucial concept of government failure. You remember those rent controls we talked about that led to huge housing shortages? That's a classic example. Or that minimum price for farmers that created a massive wasteful surplus that taxpayers had to pay for? That's another. The intervention, even with good intentions, can end up creating an even bigger mess than the one it was trying to solve.
And this brings us right to the heart of the entire issue. Economic policy is almost never about finding a single perfect solution. It's about a constant, difficult trade-off. Do we prioritize the raw efficiency of the market, or do we intervene to create a fairer society, even if it costs us some of that efficiency?
There is no easy answer here, and that's honestly what makes this topic so fascinating. Every single policy, from a tax on sugary drinks to funding for public schools, involves trying to balance these competing goals. The debate over just how much the government should do is, and always will be, at the absolute center of economics and politics. So the real question for all of us is, for our economy today, where do you think that line should be drawn?